Drink too much coffee. You eat out too much. You shouldn't buy that fancy phone. You don't know how to budget. That's why you don't have any money. Maybe you've heard these reasons for why you're struggling to get by. People of color hear them all the time. They are lies.
Hi, everybody. Auntie speaks. Welcome back. We are going to talk about wealth inequality and why it's racist. Have you noticed that in today's world? Comment below. Is everything racist? I mean, seriously, they've made the word racist like saying the sky is blue. I mean, when in my youth, when you said racist, people are like, oh my God, someone was racist? That's terrible. Now you're like, oh, okay, what else is racist? Let's listen to this lady, and she'll tell us why it's racist.
Listen up. To understand this struggle in America, we have to look at the role of race in our economy. For people of color in the U.S., the root of our financial insecurity stems from institutional racism and white supremacy that has existed since the founding of this country. Let's start with home ownership. Buying a house is supposed to be the way middle-class Americans build wealth. Of course, these days, many Americans are struggling to make this dream come true, and for people of color, it used to be practically impossible. And that was by design. By design. Starting in the 1930s, Black people in this country were systematically denied the opportunity to purchase homes because of a racist scheme called redlining. Majority Black and brown neighborhoods were literally colored in red and shut out of home loans.
Redlining. Redlining. Okay, let's do a little thought experiment here. Redlining was in the 1930s. 1930s. It was a terrible practice. It was not widespread. It was specific areas, specific cities, specific racist people. It was not like across the entire country. We all know where it was, right? Except I think it happened a little bit in the North too. This is probably one of the only racist policies that's some of it happened in the North. I believe it was New York. It was outlawed in the 1960s. It is 2020. Okay? There is no reason today why you can't be in the middle class because your great grandmother or your grandmother did not own their own home. My grandparents owned their own home. It was a very, very small home. It was like a shack, basically. But no wealth came from that home. And most homes that were bought in the 1930s, unless you bought it in a specific area, you did not like create generational wealth from that home purchase. Okay, so this is not the reason for generational wealth, and it's really stupid to continue bringing it up. Are you going to bring up slavery for generational wealth too? That was, 1865 when that was outlawed. How long do you get to live off of racism in the past to explain why you won't do the right things today?
You've heard of subprime mortgages, right? Those products that wrecked the economy in 2008 and destroyed Black and Latino wealth. Well, they were generated during the redlining era. Housing is just one bit of institutional racism that hinders the ability of people of color to build wealth.
Wrong. Sorry, you lose. That it is exactly wrong. The housing crash of 2008 and 2009 were because of some bribe. Yes, it was not because of redlining. It was not. It was actually because the government got involved in loans. And whenever the government gets involved in loans, it's bad. And they were actually trying to increase home ownership, especially in the minority community. So they were literally trying to solve what she's complaining about. And it caused the crash because they gave loans to people who they knew were not credit worthy because they were backed by the government so they wouldn't lose any money. That's how we got the crash.
So, acknowledging that the past was rigged, we can better understand our present. And in the present, the racial wealth gap is enormous. Even when Black and Latinx households earn a solidly middle-class income, they accrue just a fraction of the wealth of white households. And remember when I mentioned mass incarceration? It is yet another profit-driven, predatory system that strips savings and earnings from people of color. We make up 67% of the prison population, despite only being 37% of the US population. Hopefully you're starting to understand how shaming people, especially people of color, for a cup of coffee or a nice dinner out is ludicrous.
Okay. Okay. So I love this. There is an income difference between African Americans and white Americans. Now, why? According to this lady, it's because of redlining in the 30s and the economic crash in 2008, which was caused by both Republicans and Democrats pushing loans on people who were not creditworthy, and a large portion of them were minorities. Okay. But according to her, it is redlining in the 30s. It is the crash of 2008, and it's the prison population. So if you commit a crime, we're not supposed to send you to jail. That's done wonders for New York, Baltimore, LA, Chicago. Yeah. I've done a couple videos. I'll link them in the end here of crime in New York and their no bail policy, because it's a direct result of what this lady is talking about. Okay. You commit a crime and you're let out. We can't charge you bail because that would be bad. So they get out and they commit another crime, and then they get arrested and they get out and they commit another crime. And unfortunately, a lot of times they do stuff like murder people when they get out. So is there a different explanation? Is there possibly a different explanation? Maybe? Yes, there is. I'm going to bring in some people who've done some research. Data. Data is good. Let's take a look at data on why there is a wealth difference between white households and Black households. Okay, guys, so we are going to read here Roland Fryer. So he is a African American who grew up in the South, and he talks in this Wall Street Journal article, I've linked it below, about how he was raised, that racism was a big thing and it was really, really bad and you could never get ahead. That's what his grandmother told him, and that's what he wrote in this article. But he is also an economist. Okay, so this is what he writes. A decade after the McDonald incident in graduate school, I read a 1995 paper titled The Role of Pre-Market Factors in Black-White Wage Differences. Using a national representative sample of more than 12,000 14 to 17-year-olds from 1979, Derek A. Neal and William Johnson estimated that Blacks earned between 35% to 45% less than whites on average. They examined how much of the wage gap could be attributed to present-day discrimination in the workplace versus differences in skill as measured by the Armed Forces Qualification Test, a cousin of the ACT and SAT. Importantly, they weren't trying to measure the effect of America's racist history, running back to the early 17th century when the first African American slaves were brought to work the tobacco farms of Virginia, only the extent to which Blacks earn lower incomes because employers today make racially discriminatory decisions. Nor did they focus on prejudice more broadly. They ignored that my grandmother was spat on in the parking lot at work and concentrated on whether she was treated fairly once she entered the building. We find, they wrote in the abstract of their paper, that this one test score explains all of the Black-white wage gap for young women and much of the gap for young men. With their approach, anti-Black bias played no role in the divergent wages among women. A Black woman with the same qualifications as a white woman made slightly more money and it accounted for at most 29% of the racial differences among men, with 71% traceable to disparate performances on the AFQT. That's the Air Force qualification test. The AFQT itself was evaluated by the Pentagon, which found that Black and white military recruits with similar AFQT scores performed similarly on the job, indicating no racial bias. The paper felt like an attack on what I knew, an assault on all those conversations with my grandmother, which taught me that racism, present tense racism, dictated Black-white inequality. I told myself that Messrs. Neal and Johnson, both of whom were white, were probably bigots, and I set out on a mission to disprove their work, which is what you should do if you are a scientist. Okay, back to the article. I vented about my battle with Messrs. Neal and Johnson's to fellow graduate students at Penn State, a white guy from the cornfields of Southern Illinois. He was no more at home at the top 25% economic doctoral program than I was, and we spent a fair amount of time together during our first year, staring at Euler's equations. I don't know who Euler is. In our favorite textbooks. Recursive methods in economic dynamics. That sounds like fun. I told him I was sure discrimination was a bigger factor than Messrs. Neal and Johnson were letting on, but I just can't get this data to cooperate. The darn data doesn't go where I want it to go. He asked why I was so convinced, and I erupted in a rant about the prevalence of racism and recognized bigots on sight. My grandmother would have nodded rhythmically along. My friend responded with a burst of loud, sharp laughter in my face. He pointed out how far I was straying from Euler's equations, how on any subject other than race, I would have never given into such sloppy thinking. The double identity, a classically trained economist taught to tease out causal relationships, and a Black Southern boy taught that discrimination is ubiquitous, had lived seamlessly inside me until that moment. Messrs. Neal and Johnson, as it turned out, aren't bigots, and their conclusions have stood the test of time and my attempts to disprove them. I extended their analysis to unemployment, teen pregnancy, incarceration, and other outcomes, all of which follow the same pattern. Moreover, the relationship between skills and wages has been confirmed by study after study, even when using different data and methods. Kevin Lang, an economist at Boston University, corrects important issues in Messrs. Neal and Johnson's work, but finds the same relationship between AFQT scores and wages. Taken together, an honest review of the evidence suggests that current racial inequities are more a result of differences in skills than differences in treatments of those with the same skill. So what does this all mean? This means that past discrimination was terrible. But today we still have an income gap between Blacks and whites, and it is not because of race. It is not because of race. It is because skills and family structures lead to all outcomes. The biggest determiner on whether you will succeed in America are three different things. Graduate from high school, do not have children out of wedlock, and get a job. If you do those three things, you will not be poor in the United States. That has been found in study after study after study from both left-leaning Brookings Institute and right-leaning Wall Street Journal et al. Both of them find the same thing. If you do those three things, you will not be poor. Okay? It's very simple. Very, very, very simple. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.